welcome to Marginalia, where we discuss the impacts of literature and how it can shape our lives. So in this episode, we're going to be talking about The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I'm really excited about today's episode because I am in love with this book. After reading it, I have a very different perception than before, and I can't wait to share with you guys all about it. This book is about our main character, Addie LaRue, who made a deal with the god to grant her freedom from her medieval village in France in the 1700s. And she got that freedom, obviously, but at a cost. And the cost is that everyone who meets her will forget about her as she turns her back on them. And quite literally, for example, if Addie leaves the room and the person stays in the room, then they won't be able to remember Addie because her face disappeared, basically. And obviously this problem causes her lots of stress and gives her a lot of disadvantages as she ventures throughout the world at different time frames, because she got her freedom and she can't die and she can't leave any mark on the world. Therefore, in short, this book follows Addie as she explores the world, as she tries to live on with her curse, which she originally wanted to be a wish. However, this book mainly focuses on a turning point in Addie's life when she meets someone who is able to remember her. So for me, this book has a mix of fantasy and fiction, yet it is also very realistic because the way that Schwab writes is just very magical, and I can paint a scene in my head and follow it very easily. So now that we got the summary out of the way, let's introduce our characters. Our main character is Addie LaRue, and she was born in the 1700s, and she has lived a long life up until now. Throughout the book, we follow her story throughout her struggles, her happy moments, and everything in between, as she learns how to make a mark on the world and how she's going to live her life with the curse. The next few characters, I don't want to say too much about them or else they're going to be spoilers. So we have Henry Strauss, who is a librarian, and then Look, who's the so-called god that makes the deal with Addie. And obviously, just like any other books, there are way more characters in this amazing novel, but the main characters are those three. If we want to get into it, there's Robbie and there's B, who are Henry's friends. And there are more characters who come in here and there throughout Addie's story, and they are the people that she meets as history unfolds itself. All right, let's talk about the book now. I would say that this book is a very slow start for me, and it was painful to read at the beginning, I have to say, because I just couldn't get through it. Some books, you just have to put it down after a few minutes and then check your phone. And this, I'm going to be honest, this book, I did that quite a few times in the start, the first 100 pages, I'd say. And I was just like, is this book gonna be as good as people say it was? Because when I first started it, I had very high expectations. I thought the story was going to unfold itself so fast, everything was going to flow so smoothly, but no, it was really boring for me to start, and I had trouble reading it in the beginning. So this is just a heads up when you start reading it, because this book, although it's very good, the beginning may catch you off guard. Continuing on, as the world built up and the plot begins to thicken and the characters got more complex and we get to learn more about them, the book pulled me in and I finished it so fast in no time. I remember after I got through maybe the 130 page mark, I was like, I cannot put this book down. It went by so fast. I was absolutely absorbed in it. I feel like most books are like this though. At the beginning, it's not as intriguing, but then once you hit a certain plot point at a certain time, you get absolutely dragged into the plot, and it's like you're in the story too. And this book really done it for me. And also another reason why I might like this book so much is because I'm a teenager myself, and this novel really resonated with me because I felt how Addie was struggling to live her life to the fullest because she has so much time on her hands and she wants to explore the world. And sometimes I'm scared about that too because I have no idea what's going to happen in my future. So I'm constantly stressed out and on the lookout for new things to explore. But I feel like there's nothing wrong with just staying stable. And that's kind of ironic because as we move on, we're going to learn more about Henry, and that has a correlation to his story. Spoiler alert, everyone. So as we know, or you might not know, as I know, Henry also made a deal with Look. And his deal is that everyone who sees him automatically likes him, falls in love with him, praises him, admires him. But he only has 1 year to live because he traded his soul for that. And that is why, as we see in the novel towards the end, Henry is constantly looking for new things to explore because he has so little time and he doesn't want to waste any of it. That's why when Addie, who has lived for, let's say, 300 years, has gone to all of these places, Henry has never been. So there's a little conflict in that, how Addie has went there, but Henry hasn't. But Henry also wants Addie and him to go to new places. So that's something stressful. And I personally, I understand how both of them feels because I often feel the same way. So it's very hard to just resonate with one character. And that's what's so amazing about V. Schwab's writing. She incorporates these emotions really well into her characters, and the way that she expresses it makes the audience, the reader, feel the same because I feel that way too. Now let's talk structure of the book. When I went in, I did not expect the book to be written like this. I thought it was just going to be one normal chapter, but no. This book is so unique, and in my opinion, because I know there's obviously lots of other books that utilize this, but I haven't read one like this for so long. So let's talk. Basically, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue is split up into big sections. Section 1 has 15 chapters, section 2, 15. Each section has about 15 chapters, and there's about 5 or 6 sections, I'd say. And each chapter is quite short. The shortest is 1 page, 2 pages. And the longest, I'd say, is 10. So it's very easy to get through. The most interesting part, however, is that it switches between modern time in a sense, like 2013, that's when the actual story takes place, and it switches back all the way to when Addie was born, her early life in the 1700s, and goes on from there. So the time in the past passes by really fast. It goes by in months. But the chapters in the present time to 2013 goes by really slow. It could be 3 chapters about the same day. In the beginning, I had some trouble trying to remember what happened last in this specific timeline because, as I said before, the timeline switches off every single chapter. So chapter is about 1700, the next is about the 2000s, and then the following chapter is back to 1750, for example. So I'm trying to remember what happened last in 1750s. But as the book moves on and you read more about her story, everything flows so well together. It stitches together. So I had no more trouble trying to figure it out. It just came by naturally to me. I could remember everything that happened. And honestly, I feel like that's so hard to do as a writer, to keep your readers following through the book, not just skimming through the pages, but actually indulged in it. And that's why I think V. Schwab is so, so, so good. And more about the story is that the book doesn't only show the story from Addie's perspective. There's also many chapters from other characters' perspectives, and I remember very vividly that a whole section is about Henry's backstory, because he's also a pivotal part of Addie's life. So that was very refreshing and interesting to see just how another character's emotions are and how his story also links to Addie's, and everything is like parallel. It's so interesting. What this story did for me was that it made me realize that a great story, in my opinion, has to have a full circle moment. And that's exactly what this book has. So for me, what that looks like is that every character is connected in a way, and their stories are written like that for a reason, because they all link together at the end. And that's just so, so beautiful to read. On top of that, the full circle moment, another thing that V.E. Schwab does so amazingly, so good to read, is that each section begins with an art piece. It's either painting, sculpture, or any piece of artwork. And there's a description, there's the author of the piece, there's everything you would expect to see in an art gallery is written on that front cover of each section. And as you read, you will notice that the descriptions of these pieces correlate with what the section covers, what the section is about. And that is just so mind-blowing. How do you think of that? How do you manage to incorporate these actual artworks into what the section is talking about? It's just so fascinating to read and just gives your head a whole, oh my gosh moment. I want to give an example of what I said earlier about the art pieces, but it's kind of a spoiler. It's not a major spoiler alert, it's just a little spoiler alert, so be warned. Basically, one of the pieces that was written, that was put into the section, was a painting, and the description said that the figures in the painting were two known madams of early French history in a salon, but another woman, and I quote, "an elegant lady with a freckled face," end quote, remains a mystery. Now, after reading the section that explained the actual scene in the salon, which is the section that follows the painting, I love how Schwab leaves a little mystery between her lines for the reader to figure out. And by that, you had this initial idea of what the painting was because you read at the beginning of the section. And then as you explore the story, you had no idea that it was coming. You had no clue that she was going to insert this into the actual scene. And that's just mind-boggling. So clever of her. So obviously, as I read it, as I uncovered this clever writing by Schwab, I was so amazed at how smoothly she weaved that into the description of the painting and the story, and I was so excited to hunt down more of these little catches in the next chapters. As I mentioned a myriad of times, Schwab's beautiful writing, I also want to point out that there's also a lot of good points in her writing, a lot of good adages, a lot of good doctrines, and a lot of life advice, I'd say, in a way, that I definitely bookmarked and will come back to. Her story is very inspiring, and I feel like that's an overarching theme with Addie's as well. It wants to inspire its readers, and I definitely was inspired by her, both of them. And moreover, I remember being on TikTok, and then there were an abundance of book talks that talked about how Sarah J. Maas was able to build an amazingly complex world in her books. And as I read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, I thought the same thing as V.E. Schwab. Although this is a standalone novel, the story is so complex, so well written, so incredibly difficult to build, I feel like, but it was so beautiful to see how V. Schwab incorporated her characters, her story, everything into a grand novel, and it's a very complex world in my opinion, and there's so many more stories to unfold in Addie's one story. So I think that is enough to engulf the reader in the book. Now let's talk more about the analysis of the book. In short, I think what V. Schwab was trying to express in this story, what her underlying message is how women can't leave a mark on society. And that's a really good theme, in my opinion, because it's broad. There's a lot of room to explore within that. And V. Schwab utilized it in a really good way to help her characters, to help Addie find her own sense of life in a way. So this book is not only an example of how women can't leave a mark on society, but it also tries to resolve that stereotype through Addie's actions, through her story. And it's kind of like one book has both sides to a story. And another good category of this book that this book falls in, I would say, is the gut-wrenching portrayals of love in literature. As different as it sounds from other themes, I feel like this book is a really good example of that, because there's a few smaller love stories within the book, but they all, at the end, they all add up to the portrayal of love. And I think the gut-wrenching portrayals of love in literature explains the story very, very well. So let's talk a little bit more on love, because I'm hooked. So count me in. Let's get started. Also, what I'm going to be talking about next, I feel like is quite a spoiler alert section for people, so watch out. First, let's talk about Addie's relationship with Henry Strauss. So Addie and Henry's story is kind of a fated destiny, and I put quotation marks around that, fated destiny, because if you know, you know. We'll talk more about it later. But they basically met at a library. Addie was trying to steal a book. The next day she comes in. She thinks that no one will remember her, but Henry remembers her because he's the main male character. So he's like, "What are you doing here? Aren't you the girl who stole a book yesterday?" And that's their initial interaction. So they build more off of that, and they start becoming friends, and then more than friends, obviously. And as any love story goes, they have a great time in the few weeks, I'd say, because the present time passes by really slow. So I'd say about the first month, they had great interactions, great story, everything was good. And obviously, Addie did not tell Henry that she has this curse, and Henry never suspected because it would always be the two of them. There were no friends that were involved. But as the story evolved, Addie met Henry's friends, and that's when things started to get really awkward because his friends would not recognize her, would not remember her, and Henry would be like, "What?" And that's when the plot thickens, because Addie confesses to Henry what she did, who she is, who she actually is, what her story is. And plot twist, Henry made a deal with Look as well, just like Addie. So they confess everything to each other, but Henry never told Addie that he had only 3 months to live by the time that they met. Also, I must say that when this plot twist happened, that Henry was like, "I made a deal with him too." That was when the book really hooked me. And I'd say that was in the middle of the entire story. And I was honestly confused as I read the book. I was like, what's he talking about? What's going on? What does he mean he made a deal? So I had to slow it down and then just take my time and read, because I desperately wanted to Google things up, but I did not want to be spoiled. So my advice to you for this book specifically is to just follow the book. Do not search up anything on the internet. But I guess if you listen to this entire episode, you might know a lot of things, but I'd recommend just take it slow and just read. But anyways, Henry and Addie's relationship is romantic, really loving relationship. Everything's great, I'd say. They had great communication, and I feel like they were the happy couple in the book. And not that there were like any other really big couples, but they had a really good story in my opinion. And the ending, you guys, the plot twists just keep on coming. Spoiler alert right now. So Henry's deal was supposed to end, let's say, on September 1st. Addie does not want him to lose his life because she wants to be with him forever because he's the only one that can remember her, except for Look, obviously. But her and Look's relationship is way more complex, and we'll talk about that later. Anyways, she wants him to live on forever, just like her. But obviously that's not possible, so she just wants him to live, not die today. So Addie goes to make a deal with Look, but we don't know that. We don't know that until the very end on September 1st at night when Henry's ready to accept his fate, only to find out that he does not die because Addie saved him, because she made a deal with Look himself to spare Henry's life. That was such a plot twist. I totally thought he was going to pass away that day, but it's also very sad what happens afterwards because, spoiler alert again, they do not come in contact. They lose contact because of the deal that Addie make. We'll talk more about it later. They just disappear from each other's lives. So in this case, it's like a win and lose situation. Your win is that you get to live and you hope that you would get to reunite with your lover, but the lose is that you don't, and you're forever lost in search for them. And I also want to bring in Henry's character development on this point because he went from unable to face how others viewed him, like in the beginning of the story, when others would disapprove of him or however they acted, he would overthink it and just not be happy with himself. 2, appreciating the true unfiltered way that people see him. He does not care at the end of the story how others view him. I feel like it's more because of what he went through with Addie, how he acknowledges that there are people out there who has harder lives than he has. So he realized that from that he's able to be loved too without the curse. So I think that's why he came to accept that at the end. And even more, in the beginning of the story, he didn't seem to accept his fate, that others were going to hate him, to dislike him, and he wasn't able to accept his life. And he didn't cherish anything. He kind of got wasted. But in the end, as well as his character development along with that, he ended up learning how to cherish his life up until the last moment when he thought he was going to die. And I think that, although he didn't, it was such a huge hit to him, and it will teach him lessons to always live your life to the fullest. All right, let's talk about Addie and Look's relationship, because although it is not very explicitly throughout the text, it is intricately woven into each story, into each chapter. So let's talk. Addie and Look, their relationship is very fantasy-like. I think it's what you would expect out of a fantasy book. So throughout the story, they have I feel like I could say it's enemies to lovers, but it's more one-sided because Look, he admitted it. He was like, he's in love with Addie, but Addie never thought of him as a lover because she held on to the curse and the anger that she felt when Look made everyone forget about her, and she's mad about that ever since it happened. So it's kind of a grudge that she'll never let go, which is totally understandable because here Addie told him that she wanted freedom. He took away her everything else besides freedom. So it's kind of equal, I'd say. But also, I wouldn't say that Look really loves Addie, because although Schwab wants the readers to think that Look loves her and Addie feels like he wants her to know that he loves her too. The readers and Addie both know that he only does what he does to her because he wants her to be his possession. It's more like a possessive love instead of true love. Because we have to remember throughout the story, Luck isn't a real man. Originally, he is portrayed as a man that Addie always loved, always wanted to be hers. And that's what he showed up as because he's imaginary. But at the same time, throughout the book, we see his real identity, which is just shadow, like darkness, shadow. He is not a real man. He evolves into shadow when he takes other people's souls, and he just portrays himself as the man that Addie desires because he wants Addie's soul. That was really complicated, but to put it in short, Luck only loves, quotation mark, loves Addie because he wants to take her soul, but Addie won't let him take her soul. So he tries really hard to impress her and love her, to make her fall in love with him. And in the end, the ultimate goal is still to have her soul. So let's talk about the deal that Addie makes with Luck to free Henry. It's a deal that says, as long as you want me to be with you, I'll be with you. And Addie explains that she used as long as you want, not forever, because who knows, if Luck doesn't want her anymore, then she's free to go. She's free to pursue her own life. But we don't know if that's ever going to happen because as far as it looks, Luck is still very, very interested in Addie. Also, spoiler alert, but I feel like this whole thing has been spoiler alerts. But anyways, the last chapter, Addie explains her deal with Luck, and she talks about how her plan to escape Luck can take more than 100 years. And by her plan, I mean Luck doesn't want her anymore. It could take more than 100 years, more than Henry's human lifespan. Therefore, I feel like Addie wants to ultimately escape Luck's control and be truly free. And Henry was just a piece of puzzle that paused her plan in ultimately doing so. So Addie has a very complicated relationship with Luck, but as you think more about it with Henry too, it's like, are we going to meet again? What's going to happen next? Did she really love him? If she did, why did she escape him? But if she didn't, she wouldn't have made the deal. So it's a very controversial topic, I feel like. And V.E. Schwab ended the book in a very open-styled ending because only the readers can imagine what happens next. So that's basically how Addie's story ends in the book. But let's talk about Henry's ending in the book. So Henry wakes up the next morning, September 2nd, let's say, actually remembers what happened. He remembers that Addie saved him, which is surprising. I thought he wouldn't remember, but he writes a book based on the story of Addie because when they were still together, Addie would tell him all about her story, how she moved from France, how she explored the world, and Henry would listen. And at the end of the story, Henry was like, if Addie's no longer with me, I want her story to live on. And Henry remembers that no one ever remembered Addie. So he wants Addie's story to live on, just as Addie wants her own story to live on. So Henry takes her goal in his hands and write the book, The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. So technically, this book is written by Henry. It's their story, but obviously it's not. It's written by V. Schwab. There's a lot of elements within it, but that's another full circle moment. I was like, this is amazingly clever, so beautiful to read. It's just so well crafted together. Everything draws back. This is what Henry was talking about. This is the book that he was going to write. This is his book about Addie's story. So this book, just from this episode, I hope I didn't make it too confusing, but it is a very complex book. I wouldn't say it's confusing. I'd say it's just very, very well crafted, very well written, and there's a lot of elements that go into it, and that's what makes it a great story at the end. And obviously, there's a lot of things that I didn't cover today, a lot of details that I left out, a lot of smaller points in the story, but I just wanted to give you guys a heads up on this book, on how amazing this book is, and give you guys what I thought about the ending, because that's what I think was the most important part in the book. It was so detailed, and I love reading it. So I would definitely recommend checking this book out, and I would give this book a 9 out of 10. All right, that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed listening, and until next time, happy reading.